The Jets are expecting big things in 2024, and if some unexpected players improve, it could take the team to the next level. We're talking Jets breakout candidates today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, May 21st, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, we are now in OTA season. The Jets are going through their offseason program, and this is the time of year where typically you get the first hint about a potential breakout player. And today we're going to discuss some players who could potentially fill that breakout role for the Jets in 2024 and what their potential improvements could mean for the team. Now, I'm going to start by talking about the offensive line. Jets have some pretty big names on the offensive line now, anchored, of course, by Tyron Smith. The Jets also brought back Morgan Moses, who spent a year with them back in 2021. Also at the tackle position, the Jets drafted Olu Fashanu, 11th overall. And for whatever reason, now I'm starting to hear some discussion about David Bakhtiari possibly being in the mix for reasons I can't quite decipher, but at least he'd only be like the fourth tackle if that did happen. And those are just rumors at this point. And then on the interior, you've got Joe Tippmann starting his second season. But there are two guards for the Jets who are kind of question marks, and they're question marks for different reasons. You have John Simpson, who's projected to be the starting left guard, and you have Elijah Vera Tucker, who's projected to be the starting right guard. And I think that when it comes to performance, when they're on the field, Vera Tucker is the guy who's the more sure thing, because the last two seasons, AVT has looked really solid. They've moved him around to a bunch of different spots. He's played three positions in the last two seasons. He played the right guard spot, left tackle briefly in 2022, and then right tackle in both 2022 and 2023 for a stretch. And this is not even including 2021 where he played left guard. So in a short 3-year career where two of the 3 seasons have been cut short very early from injuries, Elijah Vera Tucker has already played 4 of the 5 spots along the offensive line. But as we know, the question with AVT is simply, can he stay healthy? On the other side, you have John Simpson, who is a free agent signing from the Baltimore Ravens. And if you look at Simpson's career, it's kind of unremarkable. He was originally drafted by the Raiders. They let him go. He was with Baltimore. And even last year when he got a starting left guard job in Baltimore, he wasn't that great. I mean, the Baltimore Ravens were a really, really good team, and they had a dominant rushing attack. But Simpson himself, I mean, he wasn't really a standout player. He was a guy who, was just kind of there. I think Simpson's the type of guy where if he's the 5th best guy on your offensive line, at least at this point of his career, you feel like you're in pretty good shape. Whereas if he's like the 2nd best guy, you're in a lot of trouble. Well, in Baltimore, and probably with the Jets this year, Simpson will be the 5th best guy unless he improves. And the one thing I could say for Simpson, again, is if you're looking trajectory, and sometimes when you evaluate players, you have to look not just where they are right now, but you have to look at where they came from. You have to look at, is this player on the upswing? And Simpson's trajectory is pretty impressive. I mean, he's gone from a guy who was, somebody who wasn't really expected to do much with the Raiders. Then they let him go in Baltimore, where, he was what's known as a reserve future signing, where, they didn't even really guarantee him a spot on the 53-man roster. He was just kind of like an afterthought signing, a guy who you sign so that you can bring 90 guys to training camp. You only have 53 guys on your roster, but you bring 90 to training camp. He was what's known as a reserve future signing. So essentially what that means is, he's a guy who's really viewed as one of the 90 guys, not one of the top 53 guys. And he ended up winning a starting job in Baltimore. And while he wasn't spectacular, and I think in particular, he had a lot of penalties last year. He was among the conference. He was among the leaders when we're talking about guards as far as penalties go. He's got some impressive physical attributes. And again, even though he wasn't great last year, the fact he was able to start and the fact he was able to, not be a complete disaster, that suggests maybe this is a player who's still got some room to grow. Perhaps this is a player who's on the upswing. And in AVT, you've got a guy who is very good when he's in the lineup. I mean, I think we all know, I think that it's pretty much unanimous among Jets fans and among the media who follow the team that when Elijah Vera Tucker's on the field, he's really good. He's especially He's especially a pretty good run blocker. The issues with AVT have been, first of all, staying on the field. And second, the Jets have constantly been moving him around because the Jets have had so many injuries on their offensive line over the last 2 years that AVT, slides to tackle. He's played both tackle spots. Even between year 1 and year 2, after the Jets signed Lake and Tomlinson, they flipped AVT from the left side at guard to the right side at guard. And looking back on that, the fact that you move your first round pick for a recent first round pick for a guy like Lake and Tomlinson, if you can do that over, I think you may have passed on that move. So essentially, you have 2 different guys here. And I think 3 of the 5 spots, at least on paper, look pretty good for the Jets because Smith is coming off a season where he was still, even in his 30s, still was a second-team All-Pro. Of course, with him, the question mark is also health, but he's not really a breakout candidate. He's already an elite-level talent. So the question with him is simply, can he stay on the field? AVT hasn't put together a full season, and I think that's part of the question with AVT is, it's one thing to be able to play well for a month. Can he string it together for a full year? It's not simply about staying healthy. Now, in a way it is, because when he's been on the field, he's been excellent. But I do think there's still a question mark about AVT, the longevity thing, because there's a big difference between playing really well for a month and playing well over the course of a full 17-game season. So I take it a step further with Elijah Vera Tucker, and I think that there are 2 questions for him. Number one, can he stay healthy? And I'm actually kind of bullish on that because the 2 injuries he suffered, they're both kind of freak things. These aren't chronic conditions the way maybe Mekhi Becton was, maybe the type Mekhi Becton was dealing with a year ago. Becton was coming off 2 straight knee injuries. And I think it's fair to speculate that, Becton's knee just may never be the same. That's just the way it goes. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, a young player suffers multiple injuries in the same spot and it kind of derails his career. Whereas with AVT, these are 2 kind of one-off injuries. The first one was more of an upper body injury anyway, so it wasn't really going to rob him of athleticism. And then the Achilles injury, which, if AVT was older, if AVT was Aaron Rodgers' age, I'd be really, really worried about his ability to return. But somebody who's, still on the younger side, like Elijah Vera Tucker, I mean, every study I've found has suggested that the odds of him recovering fully are pretty good. The questions are really, 1, can he stay healthy, which I think he will. The second question is, can he continue to produce? Is he going to get fatigued by the end of the season? I think that's a fair question. First of all, because he hasn't played a full season, in a long time. But second, again, it's one thing to be able to play well in the month of September and then into October. It's another as the hits add up over the course of the long year. Can he maintain his level of play? And with Simpson, can he keep growing? Again, the trajectory for Simpson's been very good, and he's got the physical attributes to play the guard position very effectively in this league. And, if you look on paper, this Jets offensive line looks pretty formidable. But if AVT stays healthy and looks great, and if Simpson continues to grow, I mean, this could conceivably, and I don't want to put these expectations on them because it's a lot to ask, but if these 2 question marks with both of them have high upside, things pan out for them. And if the 2 tackles, stay healthy and play well, or if Fashanu steps in, if Joe Tippmann, builds off a rookie season where he showed some promise, this could be a top-notch offensive line. I'm not necessarily saying that's what I'm expecting, but I think that, when you talk about breakout players, they can make a big difference for your team. And in the case of the offensive lineman the Jets have, that could be the difference between an offensive line that's pretty good and an offensive line that's really good. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the other side of the ball, also in the trenches. We're expecting the Jets to have a good defensive line, but there's one player who might be able to take them to the next level. It's a player who was drafted highly last year. We'll talk about who that is and what the expectations are for him continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets. Which Jets game do you want to go to this year? Do you want to head out to San Francisco for opening night week 1 on Monday Night Football? Do you want to be there for the home opener Thursday night week 3 against the New England Patriots? Maybe you want to go all the way to London for the week 5 game against the Vikings, or maybe some games later in the season, home games against the Bills and Dolphins, bitter division rivals. Maybe it's another game. Well, no matter what game you want to go to, Gametime has you covered, because Gametime allows you to save up to 60% off buying tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, and theater. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Now, you might want to get your tickets in advance. I mean, just so that you can build up the excitement for going. But with Game Time, you can also get tickets last minute. All you do is pull out your phone or mobile device. It's super easy. I've used it myself. It's incredible, and the deals you get are absolutely amazing. I mean, maybe you're a Rangers fan. You want to go to the Eastern Conference finals against the Panthers. Game Time's the place to be. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day, Monday through Friday. Today we're talking about potential breakout players for the New York Jets. OTAs are underway. That's a big part of the offseason program. It's mandated through the league that teams are allowed to have a certain number of practices through the course of the offseason. Now, these are voluntary. Players do not necessarily need to attend. The only thing that's mandatory is there is a mini camp near the end of the offseason program that players need to go to. But this is the time of year where you start to hear players get buzzed. You start to hear that the team's impressed by the way a player looks at OTAs. And while getting this sort of attention during OTAs does not guarantee a player is going to break out, this is typically like the first chapter that kind of tells you maybe there's something there. And there are some players I have my eye on this year for the Jets who can kind of take this team to the next level. In the first segment, we talked about two guys on the offensive line. And maybe I cheated a little bit with Elijah Vera Tucker because he's already a guy who's viewed as a good player. And he's rehabbing an injury. So we're not really watching him at OTAs. But I think a guy whose profile has risen over the last couple of weeks, or at least since the NFL draft, is Will McDonald, because suddenly there is a role now for Will McDonald. John Franklin Myers' trade opened up that third defensive end spot for McDonald to take over. And as we know, we talk about it's practically a cliche at this point. It's one of those things, maybe it's just something we don't even need to mention anymore. Jets rotate in defensive linemen in and out. But there's a limit to how much you can rotate. I mean, really, there are enough snaps for three defensive ends to get significant snap shares. And that's what happened with the Jets last year. They're, as much as the Jets do rotate guys in and out, the fourth guy doesn't really get many snaps. The way the Jets work it is essentially I think of it as though there are like three starters at the defensive end position, because that's the way they do things. And I think there's a logic to it. Pass rushers are at a premium in this league. You want to have guys fresh who are able to rotate in and out, but you want to when you rotate your starters out, you want to make sure you're still getting high quality pass rushing reps. And if you do that, then you can just send a constant barrage at the other team's quarterback, and your top guys will not be out of gas by the time you're trying to close a game out in the fourth quarter. Now, up until the draft, it looked like the Jets would just have three defensive ends, and they'd be John Franklin Myers, Hassan Reddick, and Jermaine Johnson, three pretty established guys. The trade of JFM opens up snaps for Will McDonald. And earlier in the offseason, as I mentioned, I mentioned after the trade of Hassan Reddick, it was difficult to see where McDonald's snaps were going to come from. Now with JFM out, the top two guys are going to be Hassan Reddick and Jermaine Johnson. But there is a question, can McDonald step into that third defensive end role? And that's I don't want to say it's essential, because the Jets have enough talent on their defense that even if they don't get a lot from their third defensive end spot, the defense should still be very good. It's the type of thing that can just like elevate the defense, though, because last year with JFM and with Jermaine Johnson, with Bryce Huff, that made a difference. Having that third guy, having three ends who are essentially starters for you, that kind of elevated the Jets defense and took it to that next level. And McDonald's rookie season was really, it was pretty quiet. I mean, he really did not make much of an impact. He only had 14 tackles. He had 5 quarterback hits, 4 tackles for a loss, 3 sacks. Was actually a healthy scratch a couple times. Only played about 19% of the snaps for the Jets on defense. And the other thing with McDonald is that he's not super young. I mean, he's going to be 25 this year, and that's not old, but that's not young. And it is kind of old for a guy who hasn't made his mark yet in the NFL. I mean, he's pretty close to his prime right now, and that's not to say that he's incapable of delivering for the Jets. What I think it means is that it's got to happen for him this year. If this was a guy who was drafted at 21 and your age 22 season is just okay, that's one thing. If your second season is your age 25 season, well, we're just about the peak of his athleticism. So if he can't do it now, I think there's a question about, really be able to do it going forward. And, last year we kind of laid out what expectations are for a guy like McDonald, who was drafted 15th overall about a year ago. I looked through the numbers, and what I found is that like the middle of the pack edge rusher who's drafted in the neighborhood where McDonald was selected, his prime will probably be like 5 to 6 years. And during that prime, he'll probably give you about 7 to 8 sacks a year. And like during his career year, he'll hit double digits and maybe he'll make a Pro Bowl. But, as much as we dream of these first round picks being superstars, it's a pretty good outcome to just get an above average player at that phase of the draft, especially at the defensive end spot. And of course, the drafting of McDonald was controversial because the Jets had some pretty pronounced needs on the offensive side of the ball. They had guys they could have drafted on the offensive side of the ball who probably could have stepped in and been day one starters. And instead, they drafted the guy at a position where they were very deep. Now, I think part of that was just a reflection of how thin last year's draft class was. The 2023 draft class was a strange one, where the overall perception was that there was just not a ton of talent in that class. And I think that maybe that changed the Jets draft strategy a little bit. Even though there may have been bigger needs on offense, I think there is a fair question about, will those players they could have drafted, yes, they may have been starters year one, but first of all, would they have been good starters? Second of all, how much are they going to produce over the long run? And that, too often, I think when we talk about the NFL draft, people are just focused on immediate needs. And look, immediate needs matter in the first round of the draft, but they're not the only thing that matter. And the thing that probably matters most is, are you going to get a guy who's going to be a great player for you, or at least a good player for you over a longer course of time? And for McDonald, look, if McDonald hits that threshold, that's 7 to 8 sacks a year, and maybe in a career year he gets to 10 and maybe even pushes for a Pro Bowl bid, the Jets are going to be pretty happy with what they have. And if you're talking about your third defensive end, if this year he goes out and produces 7 to 8 sacks for you, that's going to be a great year for him, because you have a guy on the other side, Hassan Reddick, who, over the last 4 years has been one of the biggest sack artists in the league. I mean, I think we can count on Hassan Reddick to get quite a few sacks this year. And then on the other side, Jermaine Johnson, coming off a 7.5 sack season, who's also a very good run defender. So, when we're talking about Jermaine, I don't think Jermaine really has to be a 10 sack guy. If he adds another 7.5 as like the number 2 defensive end and gives you excellent run defense, you're pretty happy with what you have, because you also have Quinnen Williams in the middle. And that's it's one of the nice things about the Jets defense, is that there's so much talent that I'm not sure one guy necessarily needs to dominate. I think, people are out there saying, well, McDonald isn't a 10 to 15 sack guy, it's a failure. I don't agree with that. I think 7 to 8 is perfectly fine. But going from a guy who is really kind of an afterthought, Will McDonald last year was probably defensive end 4 or defensive end 5, and turning him into a guy who's a regular player, who's productive, it's going to require him to take a step up this year. Last year was kind of his redshirt year. The coaching staff had a chance to work with him. Most people would tell you that when he came out of Iowa State, he was kind of raw, did not have a lot of fully developed counter moves yet. In the NFL, it's difficult to step in on day one as a pass rusher, because in college, frequently guys who are drafted in the first round as pass rushers, they're just so physically dominant that they don't need to use good technique. They can just like kind of run over offensive linemen, or they can just run past offensive linemen, or just kind of shove them aside. In the NFL, you have to use much better technique, because everyone you go against is big and strong and athletic. So you have to learn pass rushing moves. And if a offensive lineman stops your first move, you have to like have a second move you can move on to, you can get to. And there's the whole concept of like pass rushing with a plan, which is essentially, this is going to be my plan A. If he stops it, this is my plan B. These are things that are learned in the NFL. So question is how much McDonald learned them. And if he did, and if he becomes that third defensive end, well, the Jets aren't really going to miss the guys who departed. And, if he can't, it's not the end of the world for the defense, but it may make the defense take half a step back. Now, let's stay positive, though. What are some things that could make the Jets defense take a step forward? Well, as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about the position that's generally viewed as the weakest on either side of the ball, and that's safety. But there is one player out there, maybe he's got potential. Maybe he can take this Jets defense to yet another higher level. We'll talk about him as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I know Knicks fans are probably very disappointed that their team is not going to the Eastern Conference Finals. I mean, I don't know what you could do, though, with that many injuries. I mean, the Knicks just were decimated by injuries. I don't think it was really their fault. But Rangers fans can be excited, because the Eastern Conference Finals getting set to begin this week. The Rangers will take on the Florida Panthers. Well, if you're a Rangers fan and you're excited, the Rangers could win. And if you're a Knicks fan, maybe you're disappointed, but you can still win at FanDuel either way, because, again, $150 in bonus bets comes with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about players who could be potential breakout candidates for the New York Jets in 2024. It's that time of year. It's the offseason program. Media is starting to get access to the team during these spring workouts. So you start to hear buzz about certain guys who look like they're really flashing during these offseason programs. We talked about some guys on both sides of the line, both sides of the ball in the trenches, but I'd like to take a look now at a safety, Tony Adams. And last year, this time of year, the Jets were making a lot of noise about Adams. And Adams ended up taking on a starting role for this team. And he was a non-drafted free agent a couple of years ago. And we always think about our draft picks. We always think about, how big of a role they're going to have. But if you can find a non-drafted free agent, it's like supplementing your draft class. And, Adams was not spectacular by any stretch of the imagination last year, but I don't think it was a disaster either. I mean, there's some big plays he made, such as the interception against the Eagles. He picked off Jalen Hurts late in the fourth quarter, in a game that looked like the Jets were going to lose, and set up a winning touchdown. Breece Hall scored seconds later and delivered the Jets a big win. A year ago this time, the Jets were talking Tony Adams up like they thought he was going to be a star at the safety position. And it did not quite work out that way for Adams. But, he was, I don't think he was a disaster out there. I mean, I've seen, I've been watching the Jets a long time. When you've been watching the Jets as long as I have, there are certain positions where it just feels like the Jets are always awful at. Tight end's one of them. And safety's been another one. All the time I've watched the Jets, there's been very few moments where I felt good about their safety play. When they had Kerry Rhodes, that was one of them. And those couple of years where Jamal Adams and Marcus May were playing together and playing great. But for the most part of my time, all the decades I've watched the Jets, they've been dreadful at the safety position. And what I could say is, I don't think Adams was dreadful last year. I think Adams was okay. The question is whether he can build on that. And Adams was very much, I thought he was very much a hit or miss guy, where he made a lot of big plays, but he also missed on some key plays. And you didn't really notice it because there's the rest of the defense had so much talent on it that you can cover for a guy like Adams. Kind of like what I was saying earlier with Simpson. If Tony Adams is like your 10th or 11th best player on defense, you're probably in really good shape. If he was like your 4th or 5th best player, you'd be in a lot of trouble. The question is, how much can he grow? And when you talk about what this Jets defense needs, not a lot. We expect the defensive line to be really good. You got that duo, like Quincy Williams, CJ Mosley duo at linebacker, which a year ago, that was one we were questioning, and that ended up being rock solid. At corner, maybe the top trio in the league of starters: Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter II. Now the only Michael Carter on the Jets. So really the question mark is the safety position, where you've got Chuck Clark, who's been a very good player through the course of his career in Baltimore, but coming off a serious injury. I thought that was one of the savvier moves the Jets have made in recent years last year when they traded for Chuck Clark, because he was kind of just on the outs in Baltimore, not for anything he did wrong. It's just the Baltimore safety room was loaded with talent. He didn't have a spot. And the Jets snagged him for a 7th round pick, and unfortunately he got injured during the offseason program. The other end of that was Tony Adams. And then Ashton Davis stepped up a little bit last year, but Tony Adams, can he improve? I've made the comparison to Quincy Williams, because Quincy Williams' first couple of years with the Jets really hyped him up. And we saw flashes here or there, but we didn't get consistency. And then last year we got the consistency. I guess the question is, can Tony Adams be like the Quincy Williams of safeties? Is he the guy who made some big plays and missed some big plays, but eventually the game slows down for him? He figures it out. He learns when to pick his spots better. Or is he just going to be who he is? And for the defense, again, it's not the end of the world if he plays at the same level, because the Jets defense was plenty good with him last year, playing at the level they played at. Tony Adams was up and down last year, and the Jets defense was still very, very good. And again, that goes to show you how much talent there is. And safety is not necessarily a spot that makes or breaks your team for the most part in today's NFL. But if you have a great safety, if you have somebody who's an above average starter, that can add an extra element. Can Tony Adams play that deep middle? Can he be the type of guy who takes away those passes down the middle of the field? Can he be the guy? I'm not going to say can he be the kind of guy who makes the quarterback afraid to throw the ball down the middle of the field? Because that's putting a lot on him. But if he can play at an above average level this year, again, that's another thing. It's not so much that the defense is going to fall apart if he does it. It's just the type of thing that can take an already really good defense and get it to that next level. And it's kind of, in some ways, I feel like it's kind of a no-lose situation for the Jets because, again, they were able to play at a very, very high level defensively. Offense has had a lot of trouble executing with the Jets against the Jets last year, with Tony Adams playing at the level he was at. And for a guy who was an undrafted free agent, I think you have to be very happy with what you got from Tony Adams last year. I mean, if Tony Adams was like a top 20 pick, maybe you'd say, you'd be wondering, like, is that good enough? But for a guy who was an undrafted free agent to play at that level, I feel like he's become a little underappreciated. And it's funny because a year ago, this time, you heard nothing. You heard Tony Adams nonstop. You thought he was going to be the next coming of like Ed Reed or Earl Thomas. And now he's kind of flown under the radar because he got a full season starting under his belt, and it was fine. It wasn't spectacular. But he's a younger player, and I think there is still some runway for him to improve. I think there's still some runway for him to elevate his game and kind of master that free safety position. And if he does, it means good things for the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we'll have our weekly Wednesday mailbag. Can't wait to answer your questions. Talk to you then.